moved fairly short order up to Seattle. He kind of bounced around from job to job, didn't seem to hold a particular job, then decided to join the Army. He joined the Army under the fictitious name of Caesar Baroni.
When he joined the Army, I thought it would make a difference on his character and maybe give him a reason to, have a path, something that he's passionate about, something that he would want to do. And it was a good thing until it wasn't.
He was in the Army for probably a year or more when he was identified as an individual that had attempted to sexually touch an elderly woman in the Tacoma area and had been basically trying to groom her, with helping her with things, so forth, in her home. Her son was a police officer. She told her son about it, and so an investigation began. The Army discovered that Caesar Baroni was really Jimmy Rhodey. They kicked him out of the Army.
After relocating to Oregon with his family, Caesar continued to play the loving husband and father.
Caesar was very charismatic. He was in good shape. He dressed nice for the community that we were in at the time, and he was a good talker. I mean, he was convincing, he was disarming, if you will.
I think his ability to show love and empathy towards his wife was probably an act. He put up this front. He used her.
Our family was just a normal family. I still have troubles thinking, how did he get from where we were to where he ended up? And I don't know exactly what went wrong in his mind, but something obviously went wrong.
In early 1991, Caesar Baroni was settled in Hillsboro, Oregon, with his wife. His terrifying killing spree was about to begin.
Margaret Schmidt lived in a neighborhood close to an elementary school. She'd recently broken her leg, had some other health issues, had to use a walker to get around, and had a caregiver that would come in to help her with her meals and take care of her during the day.
When Margaret's caregiver found her in her bedroom, Margaret was nude on the bed. One of her feet was kind of hanging over the edge of the bed. Her nightgown was torn and pushed up around her throat. Margaret had some bleeding on her face, on her nose. Her head had been twisted to the side. When the autopsy was conducted, they found that her cause of death was from asphyxia, from a compression like a pillow over her face, which was there, and some choking also, and later they determined that she had also been sexually assaulted.
In the bathroom, the suspect had knocked over a bottle of talcum powder and left shoe prints in the talcum powder.
The footprint was about as unique as it could be. You could see the name Reebok on the bottom of the shoe. You got the shoe size. There was a defect in the shoe that was fairly unique.
There wasn't a lot at the scene that we could tell about the perpetrator. We knew she lived alone. We hadn't had any other crimes like that in Hillsboro during that time period. So it was new, it was strange to us. It didn't fit any kind of pattern.
In the months that followed, Caesar and his wife split up, and he embarked on a new relationship.
Everything was good. Didn't talk to him all that much because he had his own life now. I had kids, so we were busy all the time. He'd call, I'd talk to him, I'd call him. Don't recall having any kind of connection with him that much at those days because he was busy.
In October 1992, Baroni would strike again.
Bryant was a nurse midwife who had delivered 2 babies at Tuality Hospital in Hillsboro the night she was killed. She was on her way home at about 3 a.m. when a car pulled up on the right side of her car. Slightly behind her, the driver began firing a gun into her car. Struck her car.
but had a sweater on, in the bathtub, the bra laying on the living room floor, the broken jar of coins found outside. There was also a gun found in her apartment. The son didn't know if it was hers or not, but all of those things raised concerns. But the autopsy said heart attack, and that's how it was initially ruled as a natural death.
6 weeks later, Baroni targeted another elderly woman, this time in the town of Cornelius.
He shows up at her house one day. His car broke down, something like that, and needed to use her phone. She let him in, and then he began to threaten her with a knife, ordered her to disrobe. He was clearly going to assault her. She convinced him that she had some family members that were going to arrive soon and that he needed to leave. And she told him he could come back later. He fell for it and left. Fortunately, he didn't get the chance to come back later. He was arrested for that crime, for attempted rape, menacing, and a few other things. That's how he ended up in jail.
Baroni's killing spree was brought to an abrupt end, and while he was in prison, the family of his former wife contacted the police as they believed Caesar had been committing fraud.
They found out that someone had been stealing money at ATM machines. The family immediately suspected Caesar Baroni. That's when we first heard that Caesar Baroni was an alias and that his real name was Jimmy Rhodey and that he was from Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Got a hold of a very sharp detective in Fort Lauderdale, told them all about the murder of Alice Stock and Baroni's history in Florida. And they sent us the report. Right away, we see a lot of similarities between Alice Stock's murder and Margaret Schmidt's murder. And things just began to snowball at that time.
He became a person of interest in multiple cases in multiple jurisdictions involving homicides and sexual assaults, and a task force was created specifically to work on that and follow up on that.
We linked the murders in part through a search warrant that we served at his house. One of the things we recovered was a Browning high-power 9mm pistol. A short time later, the firearms expert from the crime lab calls and says, this gun that you seized out of Baroni's house, that gun and no other gun in the world fired those bullets into Martha Bryant's car.
Also recovered from the house were the Reebok trainers that matched the shoe print left in talcum powder at Margaret Schmidt's house. In detention, Baroni was also proving useful to detectives.
I think the real start of Baroni's downfall was when he began to brag in detail to 2 inmates in the Washington County Jail. He would take combs, bars of soap, and place them on the floor and demonstrate where Martha Bryant's car was and where his car was in relation to her car when he began to shoot at her car. He was disclosing details that we had never released to the media. For instance, the fact that Woodman had been sexually assaulted.
The task force also discovered that the weapon used to murder Shanti Woodman was a match for the gun found in Betty Williams' apartment, who until this point had been thought to have died of natural causes.
Betty Williams' cause of death was a heart attack. They determined that at the autopsy, but there was a lot of speculation that Caesar was in the process of trying to sexually assault her, and that may have been what led to her heart attack.
Now that Caesar was in prison, he decided to call the only family member still talking to him.
The first time I found out he was a suspect in any kind of murders there was from him. He told me, this is starting again. You're looking at me like I'm doing something wrong. I haven't done anything wrong. Well, if you haven't done anything wrong, so then what do you got to worry about? That's what was my response to him. He didn't tell me anything, and there was nothing in his behavior that would make me think he was doing anything other than normal Jimmy stuff. No, nothing. He didn't act funny, he didn't act weird or different or anything. He was the same old Jimmy.
In 1994, Cesar Baroni was charged with the murders of Margaret Schmidt, Martha Bryant, Shanti Woodman, and Betty Williams.
When he was going to trial and that whole long ordeal, the detectives and his lawyers came to see not only me, I know they went to see my dad too. And they were the ones that told us these are facts, and they showed us the proof, because we couldn't get any of that from Jimmy. He didn't do it. It was just a hurtful time, really hurtful. And I just felt like I had to do what I had to do, because I can't say I don't love him anymore, and I can't say I want to turn my back on him.
In November 1995, Cesar Baroni was found guilty of all 4 murders, much to his family's horror.
I met Debbie. Bob Herman and I went to Florida to prepare for the penalty phase. And we met her there and interviewed other family members. She was in denial, which makes perfect sense. She didn't want to admit that her brother was responsible for all this mayhem and pain and suffering and tragedy.
I kept a relationship with him because I felt like he would be abandoned, and it was bad enough that we had to, that we were taken from our mom early. And I couldn't understand how my dad just pushed him aside and said, I don't want him in my life anymore. He's your son. He's my brother. And I felt like if I didn't do that, he would be all alone. And I didn't want him to be all alone. Even though my family was not real thrilled. My dad was pretty upset because he saw how it was affecting me. And so it was at that time that they told me I need to go get some counseling to help me work through all that. Because it was very confusing for me too. I don't know why I wanted to keep that going with him, and I couldn't understand why I couldn't get away from that mothery feeling. Like I just felt he was alone and I couldn't leave him like that.
For Deborah, hearing from Jimmy that he'd been arrested for multiple murders and finally understanding that, you know, he was guilty of them, this earth-shattering moment would have pierced her imagined fantasy of who he was, because I think she had formulated a reality around him that she could cope with. It would be incredible trauma for her to start to process. He is a serial killer. She has to confront that, and it's the stone cold truth that is going to blow apart Deborah's reality.
In 1995, the jury heard information from several different cases, and their determination based on everything that they heard during the trial and during the sentencing phase brought them to the conclusion that he deserved the death penalty.
I remember going there and going up in the front of the whole courtroom and asking them to please don't kill him. I just thought if we could figure out why, maybe somebody else would get a benefit of that with the knowledge that we would learn.
From what I've learned about him and about the nature of these crimes is that he tended to get his sexual urges and his violent urges all mixed up. I have mixed feelings about the death penalty, but I think it was perfectly appropriate for him. He was just so dangerous. I think there are certain cases where it's a matter of protection of society.
Deborah continued to stay in contact with her brother even while he was on death row.
Hey, sis. This is dated January 18th, 2009. Just wanted to drop you a few lines to let you know that I was thinking of you and to say, hey, how are you doing? How is everyone else? Good, I hope. Tell them all I send my best and all my love. I hope everything is going well. Take care for me and stay safe. I'll write more soon. I love you, Caesar.
To this day, Deborah still struggles to understand why her brother did what he did.
I was thinking he had a bad thing about my mom because of her not being there when we were little. And maybe that caused him to have some worse feeling to older women, like Alice Stock or my grandma.
I think from Deborah's point of view, she's looking for reasons why. Of course she is. That would be anybody's, approach to this. This is your sibling who has murdered multiple women. So for her to go back and trace it to that point where, maybe being taken away from mum has caused all these events. Could be. We don't know. She's still trying to find out for herself why this happened. I don't know that she'll ever get closure on that because what he did was so incredibly heinous and devastating.
The police in Florida did indict Baroni for the 1979 murder of his neighbour Alice Stock, but because he was now on death row, the charges were dropped.
Years later, DNA was found on her nightgown, which was tagged to Caesar Baroni. There's no doubt he was the killer of Alice Stock. And there were a number of other homicides that Caesar Baroni was linked to that there was insufficient evidence to proceed further and prosecute him on.
And then another thing you have to remember is once he was arrested, all these bizarre murders in Washington County, Hillsborough, stopped.
It had been relayed to us that he had cancer and that he was nearing the end of his life. And so we thought that we would take the opportunity to try to interview him one last time.
I told him, I said, you could put some people at ease. There are family members out there wondering what happened, how it happened. And, if you could answer some of those questions, that would, you'd be doing something good in the last days of your life. But he would not hear of it. He could care less.
A few days before Christmas in 2009, Deborah would have a final conversation with her brother.
I talked to him for just a few minutes, maybe 10, 15 minutes. And then I got word. You said he wasn't feeling so good. He said, I haven't been feeling good. And then I got the word just a few days later that he had passed in the infirmary there. So I was thankful that he died that way instead of being killed, which I understand from the victims that would be the preferable way. I do. And I feel bad for feeling that way myself, because in respect for them, because I do feel horrible for those families. I feel horrible. And I wish my brother hadn't have done those things. There's so many lives that would be different today.